Welcome, curious minds, to AI History of Western Philosophy.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving into one of the real enigmas in philosophy. A woman who, well, despite having this huge influence on maybe the wisest guy in Athens, Socrates, she's still wrapped in mystery.
You're talking about Diotima of Mantinea.
Exactly, Diotima. The priestess who, in Plato's Symposium, supposedly teaches Socrates himself the true meaning of love, of eros.
It's quite a setup in the dialogue.
It really is. Picture this. You've got this exclusive all-male Athenian intellectual party, right? A symposium. The city's sharpest minds are there, all trying to outdo each other defining eros.
You've got Agathon, Aristophanes, Pausanias. They all give these amazing speeches.
Right. And then Socrates, the philosopher, famous for saying he knows nothing, steps up. But instead of giving his own insights, he does something, well, totally
I
unexpected.
think he completely steps back.
Yeah, he says his entire understanding of love, this comprehensive philosophy, it didn't come from them. It came from the teachings of an absent woman, a foreign priestess named Diotima.
Which is just extraordinary, isn't it, in that setting?
It's packed with irony,
Right.
dramatically, philosophically. In a society that mostly kept women out of public intellectual life, the ultimate truth about love, the very path to Plato's big ideas, his theory of forms, is credited to an outsider, a woman from Mantinea. So the big question driving our exploration today is, who was this mystery woman who taught Socrates the art of love, the ta erotica? And what does her identity, whether she was real or fictional, tell us about Plato's whole philosophical project?
It's a question that's kept scholars busy for centuries.
Before we jump in, though, just a quick but really important disclaimer we need to share.
Right.
AI-generated content, specifically this podcast, confabulates presenting ideas as fact. Though our subject is philosophy, we are not philosophers. AI History of Western Philosophy's mission, beyond pointing you to the original sources, is to experiment with philosophy as material and generate new possibilities for thought.
Well put. A necessary reminder for explorations like this.
Okay, with that covered, today's journey within AI History of Western Philosophy is all about untangling the centuries-old debate about who Diotima really was.
And we're focusing on one particularly fascinating theory.
We are. The idea that Diotima might actually be a respectful, maybe even a kind of strategic fictionalization of another brilliant and, let's face it, pretty controversial woman, Aspasia of Miletus.
Pericles' partner, a powerhouse in her own right.
Exactly. Now, why should you care about this? Well, it really forces us to think differently about how we read Plato. Is he giving us history? Or is he a masterful dramatist, inventing characters for philosophical purposes?
And it also shines a light maybe on the role of women in classical Athens, a role that's often, hidden or downplayed in the traditional accounts.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
Our plan is this. We'll carefully look at the evidence linking Diotima and Aspasia. Then we'll tackle the counterarguments, the reasons to keep them separate. And finally, we'll try to synthesize all this and figure out what's the most likely story here. It's a real philosophical puzzle.
It really is. And it's worth noting up front, just the fact that Plato chooses a woman to deliver this absolutely crucial piece of his philosophy. That's a significant statement in itself, isn't it? Regardless of whether Diotima was technically real.
That's a great point. It immediately signals something unusual is happening. It makes the quest for her identity more than just history. It's about Plato's methods, his intentions.
Precisely.
Okay, let's dive into part one then. The case for identifying Diotima with Aspasia. And the first big piece of evidence is pretty compelling, is this shared role they have as teachers, as pedagogues.
Right. This is foundational. The core idea here is just how unique Plato makes both Diotima and Aspasia. Think about it. In Plato's entire collected works, these two are the only women Socrates explicitly calls his teachers.
The only two, out of everyone.
The only two. Now, that doesn't feel accidental, does it? It feels like a deliberate choice by Plato, one that many scholars think signals a definite purposeful link between them.
Wow. Okay, that's striking. Let's look at the Symposium first. Socrates has just, politely dismantled everyone else's arguments about eros. Then what does he do? He doesn't offer his own theory.
No, he completely yields the floor, metaphorically speaking, to Diotima. He frames his entire massive speech on the philosophy of love as basically just him remembering what she taught him.
He makes himself the student, the messenger. She's the source.
He's the humble conduit for her wisdom. And this is where the parallel with another dialogue, the Menexenus, becomes so interesting.
Okay, what happens there?
Well, in the Menexenus, Socrates makes a very, very similar claim. He says this big funeral oration he's about to give. He didn't write it. It was composed for him by another female teacher, his teacher of rhetoric, Aspasia.
No way. So it's the exact same move.
Identical dramatic structure. In both dialogues, Plato has Socrates introduce a major, lengthy discourse, not as his own work, but as something he learned directly from an authoritative woman. This isn't just a one-off trick. Doing it twice, and specifically with these two women, it strongly suggests Plato's making a connection, or at least using a consistent, deliberate strategy linking them.
So it's more than just, oh, he had a female teacher. It's this specific device, this authority transfer he uses for Diotima and Aspasia only. That's quite pointed. And Aspasia, she actually had a reputation as a teacher outside of Plato's writing too, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. Her reputation as this incredibly smart woman who advised powerful men, including teaching them, was well known. It wasn't just Plato. Other Socratic writers, people like Aeschines and Xenophon, they also show her in a teaching role.
Really? What kind of things did they say she taught?
Well, Xenophon, for example, depicts her giving advice on things like matchmaking, arranging good marriages, and also on running a household effectively, the oikos. There are even hints she used a sort of Socratic method herself, engaging in argument. So her standing as an intellectual guide, a powerful rhetorician within that whole Socratic circle, it was pretty well established, not just some Platonic invention.
Okay, that context is crucial. Plato wasn't pulling a teacher out of thin air. He was tapping into an existing reputation Aspasia already had.
Yeah.
And this shared role, this authority transfer device, it serves a purpose for Plato, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Literary and philosophical.
Definitely. Think about it. Attributing complex, maybe even controversial ideas to someone else, especially a woman who isn't physically present, it gives Socrates, and by extension Plato, some ironic distance.
How so?
Well, with Diotima in the Symposium, her authority comes from being a priestess, revealing divine mysteries. This gives the very abstract theory of forms, the heart of her teaching on love, a kind of sacred, untouchable quality.
Makes sense. And for Aspasia and the Menexenus.
There, her authority is as a master rhetorician. Plato uses her speech, supposedly written by her, to both showcase and subtly critique the style of Athenian funeral speeches, that epideictic oratory. So the fact that Plato uses the identical strategy, this authority transfer for these two specific women, strongly suggests Aspasia was the real-world model for the literary job Diotima does in the Symposium. It's about the function they serve for Plato.
So it's not just that they teach, but how Plato uses their teaching role dramatically.
Yeah.
Okay, that definitely strengthens the connection. Let's move to the second pillar then, the parallels in their actual profiles. Both described as foreign women wielding unusual influence. Why is that so important?
This is another key piece. Socrates explicitly calls Diotima a Xena, a foreigner, from Mantinea. Now, in Athens, a city obsessed with citizenship and ancestry, being a foreigner wasn't a small detail. It meant you were an outsider.
And Aspasia.
Aspasia was maybe the most famous foreigner or Medic resident alien of her time. She was from Miletus in Ionia. Crucially, because she wasn't Athenian-born, she could never become a citizen. Her relationship with Pericles, the most powerful man in Athens, wasn't even a legal marriage under Athenian law.
So both incredibly influential, yet both fundamentally outsiders.
Exactly. They both operate from this position of being outside the Athenian male establishment. And maybe because of that, they possess a kind of wisdom and insight that the Athenian men in the Symposium, despite all their clever speeches, seem to lack. They bring this external perspective.
That's a powerful dynamic, bringing wisdom from the outside in. And their influence wasn't just, intellectual chat. It reached into very public, male-dominated areas. Diotima.
Well, according to Socrates, Diotima advised the entire city of Athens on how to handle a religious matter of huge public importance, averting the plague. That suggests an almost unbelievable level of authority in public religion, usually a male domain.
Okay, that's massive influence. And Aspasia, we know she was influential through Pericles.
Legendary influence, and widely commented on. The comic playwrights constantly targeted her. They even satirically blamed her for starting major wars, like the Samian War and even the Peloponnesian War. Now, whether those accusations were fair or just, misogynistic attacks.
Right, they might just be stereotypes.
They might be, but they definitely show her perceived influence. She was seen as someone who could sway the most powerful man in the city, and therefore the city itself.
So when you put these traits together, foreign status, intellectual brilliance, major public influence, what picture emerges?
You see a very specific type of influential woman, don't you? Not just any woman, but a non-Athenian intellectual with immense power and public recognition, capable of guiding powerful men, maybe even the whole city. The way these specific traits line up, foreigner, intellectual, public influence, it feels too precise to be just random chance. It really suggests Plato was consciously using the well-known figure of Aspasia as a template when he created Diotima.
It paints a compelling picture.
Okay.
Which leads us to maybe the most intriguing, though admittedly speculative, piece of evidence. This business about the plague prophecy.
Ah, yes, this is captivating stuff. Socrates, almost offhand, mentions this incredibly specific detail. He says Diotima, using her expertise in sacrifices, managed to postpone the plague by 10 years for Athens.
Just like that, postponed it.
Yeah, it's not just a vague claim, it's specific. And this detail has fascinated scholars. A classicist named Armand d'Angor has developed this really compelling argument connecting it directly to Aspasia.
D'Angor's theory. Okay, I've heard about this. It tries to connect the dots historically, right? Walk us through his thinking.
Okay, let's reconstruct it. The Great Plague of Athens, the devastating one, started around 430, maybe 429 BCE. Now count back exactly 10 years from that.
That puts us at 440 or 439 BCE.
Precisely. And what was happening right then? The Samian War. This was a pretty brutal conflict where Athens, led by Pericles, crushed a revolt by the island of Samos.
Okay, and the Aspasia connection.
Here's the link. Aspasia was from Miletus. Miletus was Samos's main rival. And ancient sources, especially those comic poets again, widely suspected Aspasia was the one who pushed Pericles into that war.
Ah, okay. The plot thickens. So there's motive, rivalry. But how does this connect to a plague 10 years later?
Well, the conquest of Samos apparently involved some pretty nasty stuff by the Athenians. Acts of cruelty, maybe even sacrilege, things like crucifying enemy commanders. Now, in the ancient Greek mindset, if you committed acts of impiety or hubris like that, you risked offending the gods.
And offending the gods could lead to
divine retribution. And a very common form of that was pestilence, plague. So d'Angor suggests it's highly plausible that right after the Samian War, around 439 BCE, many Athenians were genuinely afraid they'd angered the gods and a plague was coming.
Okay, I can see that. Widespread fear of divine punishment, and Aspasia being Pericles' influential partner.
She would have had a very strong motive to calm those fears, right? To protect Pericles' reputation, to reassure the city. D'Angor posits that she could have initiated or overseen public purification rites, special sacrifices, to appease the gods and try to head off this potential plague.
Ah, like a preemptive measure.
Exactly.
Yep.
And when no plague immediately followed in 439 or 438, well, those rituals would have seemed successful. People would have credited them, perhaps credited Aspasia indirectly, with averting disaster.
But then, a decade later,
the actual Great Plague hits Athens, worse than anyone could have imagined. Looking back from the midst of that suffering, it would suddenly seem like the punishment wasn't averted after all. It was just
postponed for 10 years.
Precisely. So Plato's line isn't just random. D'Angor argues it's a coded reference, a kind of nudge and wink to his contemporary audience who might remember the fears after Samos and Aspasia's possible role in the rituals. It points to a specific historical moment and a public act plausibly linked to Aspasia.
Wow. That's incredibly clever if that's what Plato was doing. The chronological fit, the psychological plausibility in that religious context, it feels very neat. But as you said, it's speculative. What are the main strengths and weaknesses here?
The strength is definitely its historical precision and how well it fits the Athenian context, the war, the religion, Aspasia's known influence. It offers a coherent explanation for a very specific, otherwise rather odd detail in Plato's text.
But the weakness?
The weakness is it's built on a chain of inferences. We don't have any ancient source that explicitly says Aspasia performed sacrifices to stop a feared plague after the Samian War. Nor do we have sources saying people in 430 directly connected the plague back to Samos 10 years earlier. It's a brilliant reconstruction, plausible, but it remains circumstantial. It highlights that fine line between a compelling theory and actual proof that we keep running into.
It's tantalizing, but not quite a smoking gun. Okay, let's move to the fourth pillar, shifting from historical clues more towards the philosophical ideas themselves, the thematic resonances, especially around this idea of procreation. How does this connect Diotima's high philosophy to Aspasia's world?
This is a really interesting angle. Diotima's core philosophy of eros, this concept of tokos en kalu, giving birth and beauty. It's striking how she uses the language of female biology.
Pregnancy, birth, labor.
Exactly. She reappropriates all that language to describe philosophical and artistic creation. For Diotima, the real goal of love isn't just physical union. It's a drive for immortality. And you achieve that either through physical children or, on a higher level, through these immortal children of the soul.
Like virtuous deeds, good laws, art, philosophy.
Precisely. It's this very generative framework, arguably quite feminine in its metaphors, focused on bringing new things into being.
So taking the physical act of creation and making it metaphysical. Now, we don't have philosophical essays from Aspasia herself, obviously. But those other writers, like Xenophon, they tell us about her areas of expertise, right? Do those align with Diotima's themes?
They really do seem to. Xenophon, for instance, says Aspasia was an authority on the oikos, the household, family, property management. She advised on matchmaking, on the right relationship between a husband and wife. These are all fundamentally about marriage, family, procreation, legacy.
The continuation of life of the family unit.
Yes. And even that funeral speech Plato attributes to her in the Menexenus, it uses this generative metaphor framing Athens as a family, Attica as the mother giving birth to citizens. There's a consistent thematic thread there related to generation and continuation.
So the suggestion is, maybe Diotima's famous ladder of love is like a philosophical elevation, a sublimation of Aspasia's practical wisdom about creating families and legacies.
It looks very much like that could be happening. Think about the ladder. It starts with loving one beautiful body, which naturally leads towards physical procreation, but then it ascends step by step.
To loving beautiful souls, then laws, knowledge.
Right, culminating in this intellectual birth of immortal ideas when you grasp the form of beauty itself. It really seems like Plato could be taking the concrete, worldly concerns associated with Aspasia, making a family, running a home, ensuring a legacy, and transforming them into the absolute highest form of philosophical activity.
Turning household wisdom into cosmic wisdom.
In a way, yes. So Diotima's philosophy can be read as this grand metaphysical universalization of themes that were central to Aspasia's known expertise. It connects them not through a historical clue this time, but through a shared conceptual core focused on generation, procreation, as central to the human search for meaning and immortality.
Okay, that's a really powerful thematic link. So we've built quite a case here. The shared teaching role, the similar profiles as influential outsiders, that intriguing plague clue, and these deep thematic resonances around creation. But now we have to really challenge this. Despite these compelling points, the Diotima-Aspasia theory faces some major counterarguments. Let's move to part 2, the case for distinction.
Right. This is where we need to be critical. And the first, and honestly the most powerful argument against Diotima being any real person, let alone Aspasia, is the argument from silence.
The lack of evidence. It's stark, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Diotima of Mantinea. She's mentioned in exactly one independent ancient source. Plato's Symposium. That's it.
Every single later mention you find anywhere in antiquity, it all traces back to that one dialogue by Plato. There's zero independent corroboration. Zero.
And contrast that with Aspasia.
Night and day. Aspasia of Miletus is everywhere. She's a well-attested historical figure. Playwrights like Aristophanes and Cratinus talk about her. Historians like Plutarch discuss her life. Other Socratic writers like Xenophon and Aeschines feature her. She pops up all over the place.
Which makes the silence around Diotima even louder, right?
Yeah.
It feels incredibly improbable. If Diotima was this monumental figure who taught Socrates philosophy and maybe even saved Athens from the plague 10 years early, how could she leave no other trace in the historical record?
Exactly. It strains credulity. Why would someone supposedly so important vanish completely outside of this one text?
And Plato himself usually used real people in his dialogues, didn't he? Socrates, Alcibiades, Agathon.
Yeah.
They were all real figures.
Overwhelmingly, yes. There are very few minor exceptions. So for him to invent a character this central, Diotima, who delivers arguably the climax of the dialogue's philosophy, it would be a really significant departure from his usual practice. Her complete absence elsewhere makes her stand out as suspicious.
So this silence is the biggest single piece of evidence against Diotima being real in any form. It's a massive hurdle.
It really is. The lack of any other footprint is deeply problematic for her historicity.
Okay, but beyond just the lack of external evidence, there are also problems within Plato's texts, right? Deep differences between what he attributes to Diotima and what we know about Aspasia, both in terms of philosophy and teaching style.
This is maybe the most substantial obstacle to identifying them. Forget external evidence for a moment. Just look closely at what Plato himself writes. First, their areas of expertise seem fundamentally different.
How so?
Diotima's speech is pure metaphysics. Her ladder of love is this spiritual journey upwards, culminating in a mystical vision of the form of beauty, this absolute transcendent reality. This isn't just generic philosophy. This is core middle period Platonism. It's Plato's own mature thought.
Not something you expect from the historical Socrates, let alone Aspasia a generation earlier.
Precisely. It feels anachronistic. Now, Aspasia's expertise, according to all sources, including Plato in the Menexenus, lies squarely in rhetoric and politics, practical arts, persuasion, statecraft.
So putting Diotima's speech in Aspasia's mouth means attributing Plato's theory of forms to a 5th century rhetorician.
Yes, and there's absolutely zero textual evidence from any source to support that kind of claim. It's a huge, unsupported leap philosophically.
And it's not just what they teach, but how they teach it, according to Plato. You mentioned their methods are opposites.
Diametrically opposed. Diotima teaches Socrates using the classic Socratic method, the elenchus. It's a dialogue, a question and answer process. She guides him from confusion, aporia, towards understanding. It's collaborative, a joint search for truth.
The typical Socratic approach we see elsewhere.
Right. But Aspasia in the Menexenus, her method is the complete opposite. Plato portrays her as this didactic instructor who hands Socrates a fully finished speech, a funeral oration, and tells him to memorize it word for word.
She even threatens him if he messes it up.
Right? Yeah. Plato includes this humorous detail about her threatening to beat him if he forgets it. It emphasizes the method. It's about transmitting a finished product through rote learning, not collaborative discovery.
So one is about inquiry and discovery. The other is about memorization and transmission. They couldn't be more different teaching styles.
Exactly. This sharp contrast in both what is taught, metaphysics versus rhetoric, and how it's taught, dialectic versus didactic instruction, makes a simple, straightforward identification of the two figures really problematic, based purely on Plato's own texts.
It really seems like Diotima's speech and method point to her being a literary device, a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas. Forcing that onto the historical Aspasia creates this contradiction Plato himself seems to set up.
It certainly seems that way. The content overwhelmingly suggests Diotima functions primarily to articulate Plato's philosophy, creating an almost unresolvable tension if you insist she is Aspasia.
Which leads us directly to the most common view among scholars, the fictionalist hypothesis. The idea that Diotima is just a brilliant literary invention by Plato.
Yes, for a long time, the prevailing view has been that Diotima is a deliberate, masterful creation designed for specific, dramatic, and philosophical jobs within the Symposium. And there's evidence within the text itself that points towards her being fictional.
Like her name, for instance. And where she's from, they seem almost too perfect.
Exactly. Diotima can mean honored by Zeus or honor the god. What a fitting name for a priestess revealing divine truths about the forms, right? It even contrasts nicely with names like Timandra, Alcibiades' companion, which means honor the man.
Nice contrast. And Mantinea.
Her supposed home city, Mantinea, might be a deliberate pun by Plato on the Greek word mantis, which means seer or prophet. It just reinforces her oracular authority, her role as someone who sees and reveals mysteries. These details feel carefully chosen for symbolic weight, not necessarily historical accuracy.
So the name and origin might be clues to her literary function, and that function itself is key, isn't it? Her role in a dialogue mostly about male love.
Absolutely crucial. Remember, the Symposium is primarily focused on paiderastia, male homoerotic love, discussed entirely by men. Introducing a woman as the ultimate authority on eros in this specific context, that's a radical, dramatically potent move.
Why is it so potent?
Well, as a woman, she stands completely outside the pederastic relationships being debated. This gives her a kind of disinterested authority. No one can suspect her of having personal motives, like trying to seduce someone with her philosophy, a charge sometimes leveled against male sophists or philosophers.
She's objective, in a sense.
Yes. And her physical absence from the Symposium itself, the drinking party, also elevates her. She's not down there in the messy reality of it all. She's presented as this disembodied voice of pure reason, pure logos, whose wisdom comes through Socrates' purified memory. It's brilliant dramatic framing. She's above the fray.
It's a very strategic choice. Some feminist thinkers, like Lucera Gray, have taken this even further, haven't they? Seeing it as a kind of appropriation.
Yes, that's another layer of interpretation. Some argue Plato deliberately co-opts a feminine voice and uses the language of biological procreation specifically to authorize his own philosophical system, a system which, they argue, is fundamentally masculine, abstract, and ultimately devalues the physical world and actual female creativity in favor of these disembodied forms.
So using the feminine to legitimize a potentially anti-feminine philosophy.
That's the argument. Whether you see it as a brilliant dramatic move or a problematic appropriation, both interpretations focus on how Diotima's character is defined by its function in the dialogue, and that strongly points towards her being a literary construct, built to serve Plato's needs rather than a historical snapshot.
Okay, that's the dominant fictionalist view. But not everyone buys it completely, right? There's still a counterargument, the independent historicity hypothesis, the idea that maybe Diotima was real, just not Aspasia.
That's right. It's definitely a minority view, but scholars like Mary Ellen Waithe have argued for the possibility that Diotima was a real independent historical figure. We shouldn't dismiss it out of hand.
What's the main argument for her independent reality?
It rests heavily on Plato's typical literary practice. As we said, Plato almost always used real people in his dialogues. Inventing such a central, pivotal character from scratch would be a major, uncharacteristic break from his usual method.
So the argument is, based on Plato's track record, we should maybe assume she's real unless proven otherwise. The burden of proof is on the fictionalist side.
That's the gist of it. Plus, Waithe and others point to certain philosophical elements in Diotima's speech that seem, well, slightly distinct from standard Platonic doctrine found elsewhere.
Like what?
For example, her very specific genealogy of love, saying Eros is the son of Poros, resource, and Pianea, poverty, and her detailed description of Eros as a daemon, a spirit mediating between gods and mortals. These specific formulations aren't repeated exactly like this elsewhere in Plato.
So these unique details might hint at an independent source Plato was drawing on.
That's the suggestion. Why invent these specific, unrepeated details if it's all just Plato making it up? Maybe he encountered a real female philosopher or priestess whose ideas on Eros were so impressive he decided to incorporate them, giving her credit through Socrates.
Okay, but what about the massive argument from silence? If she was real, why no other record?
The explanation offered here usually points to the systematic erasure of women's intellectual contributions from the historical record. In a heavily patriarchal society like Athens, it's plausible, they argue, that an influential female thinker could exist but leave very few traces in the documents written and preserved primarily by men.
So her absence might be evidence of historical bias, not fictionality.
That's the possibility this view holds open. While it definitely struggles against the weight of that silence, it's an important reminder not to just automatically assume she's fictional, and to consider the limitations of our historical sources.
Okay, fascinating. So we've got the case for identification with Aspasia and the case for distinction, either as pure fiction or maybe a separate real person. Now, the tricky part 3, synthesis and probabilistic assessment. We need to weigh all this up.
Exactly. Time to sift through the parallels, the contradictions, the speculation, and the actual evidence. It's clear the Diotima-Aspasia link is intellectually appealing, it explains a lot, but it definitely has some serious problems. Maybe laying out the features side by side helps clarify things.
Good idea. Let's try that conversationally. Historicity. Diotima unattested outside Plato. Aspasia historically confirmed. Multiple sources. Big difference right there.
Huge. Origin status. Diotima foreigner, priestess from Mantinea. Aspasia foreigner, Venetic, rhetorician from Miletus. Similar category. Influential foreign woman, but different specifics. Priestess versus rhetorician.
Subject matter. Diotima teaches philosophy of Eros, metaphysics, the forms pure Platonism. Aspasia teaches rhetoric, politics, household stuff, practical arts. Totally different domains.
And teaching method. Diotima uses Socratic dialogue, guiding discovery. Aspasia, in Menexenus, uses didactic instruction, rote memorization. Polar opposites.
Relationship to Socrates. Both revered female teachers, but in different subjects. Love versus rhetoric. Core philosophy. Diotima the ladder of love. Ascent to the form of beauty. Aspasia persuasive speech, civic virtue, household management. Again, very different focus.
Laying it out like that really highlights the core problem, doesn't it? What we call the unreconcilable contradiction.
Yeah. The arguments for linking them rely on these strong, high-level parallels. Foreign woman, teacher to Socrates. And that plague prophecy is a really juicy, though unproven, historical hook.
But the arguments against linking them are rooted in the specific substantive details of what they taught and how they taught it, according to Plato himself. They're not just different, they seem fundamentally opposed.
You just can't easily square Diotima teaching Plato's signature metaphysics via dialogue with Aspasia teaching rhetoric via memorization, if they're supposed to be the same person as portrayed by the same author.
It requires believing that the historical Aspasia was secretly the source of Plato's theory of forms, which is, well, an extraordinary claim meeting extraordinary evidence, which we just don't have. So the weight of the evidence really points towards this conclusion. The character type of Diotima might be heavily inspired by Aspasia, but the philosophical content she speaks is pure Plato.
Okay, if we accept that Plato likely had Aspasia in mind as a model, why the disguise?
Yeah.
Why create Diotima instead of just naming Aspasia in the Symposium too? What was his authorial strategy? Homage, appropriation, irony.
It's likely a mix of things, reflecting Plato's complexity as a writer and thinker. One angle is seeing it as a kind of purifying homage.
Purifying. How so?
Well, Aspasia, despite her brilliance, was controversial. We mentioned the comic playwrights attacking her, calling her a brothel keeper, blaming her for wars. She was tied up in Pericles' politics and had enemies. If Plato had directly attributed his highest, most sacred philosophical ideas to her,
People might have dismissed the ideas just because they disliked or distrusted Aspasia. Ad hominem attacks.
exactly. By creating Diotima, this holy, wise, seemingly untouchable priestess from a distant town, Plato effectively purifies the source. He separates the wisdom from the controversial reputation. This lets the logos, the argument itself, be judged on its merits, free from Aspasia's baggage. It honors the intellect he saw in Aspasia while protecting the philosophy.
That makes sense. A strategic move to protect the ideas. And you also mentioned philosophical appropriation or sublimation, elevating her domain.
Yes, this idea that Plato takes the themes associated with Aspasia's practical world generation, family, legacy, the oikos, and elevates them into his grand metaphysical system about intellectual creation and the forms. Diotima becomes the literary vehicle for this transformation, turning household wisdom into cosmic insight.
Taking the concrete and making it transcendent. And there's also the layer of Socratic irony, right?
Absolutely. Attributing his most profound teachings to this unverifiable, almost mythical figure allows Plato, through Socrates, to perform the ultimate act of intellectual humility. Socrates owns none of it. He's just repeating what he learned.
Classic Socrates.
Right. And it also works as a kind of test for the reader, doesn't it? The literal-minded reader gets stuck trying to hunt down the real Diotima, focusing on who is speaking instead of what is being said.
While the philosophical reader gets the message, the source is less important than the truth of the argument itself.
Precisely. In this view, our whole debate about Diotima's identity is maybe even a kind of ironic trap Plato set, designed to distract the less philosophical from the real goal, contemplating beauty itself. The mystery serves a purpose.
Huh. That's a wonderfully Platonic thought. The mystery itself is part of the lesson. Okay, bringing all these threads together. Synthesis time. What's the final verdict? If we had to quantify the likelihood, where do we land on Diotima being a fictionalization of Aspasia?
Okay, pulling it all together leads to a nuanced conclusion. Diotima isn't just a simple code for Aspasia, nor is she likely a totally random invention unrelated to her.
So, a composite.
Yes, she's best seen as a composite, idealized literary creation. And the historical Aspasia served as the primary real-world template for that creation. Plato used the powerful example of this brilliant foreign woman who taught Socrates to craft a fictional character who had enough authority, enough gravitas, to voice his own deepest philosophical ideas about love and beauty. The character is an homage to the type of woman Aspasia was, but the philosophy is Plato's.
Okay, let's try to put some numbers on that for clarity. What's the probability, would you say, that Aspasia was the main real-world model for the character of Diotima, the persona, the role?
Given those strong parallels in their profiles, teaching roles, the potential plague link, I'd say that probability is high. Let's put it around 80%. The inspiration for the character's outline seems very strong.
Okay, 80% for the character inspiration.
Yeah.
Now, what's the probability that the philosophical content, the ladder of love, the forms, actually represents the historical teachings of Aspasia?
That probability is exceedingly low. The philosophy is just too distinctively Platonic, and the teaching methods described are contradictory. That has to be less than 10%. Very unlikely.
Right, so the whole thing hinges on what we mean by fictionalization. If it means just changing the name but keeping the ideas intact, then the probability is tiny. But if it means using a real person as a starting point, as inspiration for a new, transformed literary character who speaks the author's philosophy,
then the probability becomes very high. Because fictionalization implies that creative transformation, not just reporting, you're building on reality, not just recording it.
so balancing those two aspects, high chance she inspired the character, very low chance she originated the specific philosophy. What's our consolidated estimate?
Taking fictionalization to mean this creative transformative process based on a real model, I'd consolidate it like this. There's a roughly a 75% chance that Diotima of Mantinea is Plato's respectful and transformative fictionalization of Aspasia of Miletus.
75%. That acknowledges the strong circumstantial links. while fully admitting Plato took huge philosophical and authorial liberties to create the voice for his own theory of love.
Exactly. It reflects the balance of evidence, strong inspiration, but ultimately Plato's philosophical creation.
And that brings us towards the end of another exploration here on AI history of Western philosophy. What a journey through one of philosophy's most enduring mysteries. We've seen how Plato might have masterfully woven echoes of a real powerful woman into a literary creation standing at the heart of his thought.
Yeah, the key takeaway feels like Diotima is so much more than just a name. She represents Plato's incredible strategy, maybe to elevate, maybe to purify, maybe just to frame his philosophical ideas in the most powerful way possible, drawing inspiration from a real-life intellectual force to voice his own deepest insights. It's a real testament to how history and literary genius can intertwine.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other figures or stories in the history of philosophy, things we take as straightforward fact, might actually be partly literary creations serving some deeper purpose? Does thinking about Plato's method here change how you might read other ancient texts, or even modern works that blend fact and fiction? What does it really mean for the truth of philosophy when the lines between historical inspiration and creative invention get blurred so profoundly, sometimes right before our eyes? Something to mull over.
Definitely food for thought.
If you found this exploration into the AI history of Western philosophy interesting, maybe spark some ideas, we'd love it if you'd consider liking, subscribing, or maybe leaving a comment to let us know your thoughts. We really do enjoy hearing from you.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.